carrying out the heavy task that has been laid upon me, and to which I now dedicate what remains to me of my life, I pray for the guidance and help of Almighty God.
In this video, we're diving into a moment that just shook the entire nation. King Charles made an announcement that nobody saw coming. One that reveals the emotional reality behind palace walls and confirms what's next for Prince William. Stay with me until the end, because what happened after this statement will leave you speechless, and you'll understand why this changes everything for the royal family forever. Make sure to hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss any updates on this developing story. It was exactly 1 minute ago when King Charles stood before the nation and delivered words that felt more like a goodbye than a royal announcement. The clock had just struck 7 in the evening at Highgrove House, his private countryside residence. Autumn darkness was slowly covering the royal gardens. Everyone knew something important was about to be announced, but nobody expected it to sound so final, so deeply personal. Television crews from every corner of the planet had their cameras pointed at this quiet estate, not at the grand Buckingham Palace, because this wasn't about royal ceremony. This was about something much more real, much more human. When King Charles walked toward the speaking platform, he moved slowly, carefully, leaning on a wooden cane for support. His suit seemed too big for his body now, hanging loose on his shoulders. His hands shook just slightly, but the cameras caught every small tremor. Behind him on the wall hung a portrait of his mother, Queen Elizabeth, lit by a single warm golden light. The message was clear without words being spoken. One ruler's time fading, another's beginning. Charles spoke with a voice that was calm, but filled with deep feeling. He said he'd watched service to the nation for over 70 years. Now, as time and his failing health reminded him he was only human, he'd decided to make sure that service would continue through his son, the Prince of Wales. Those words seemed to hang frozen in the air, echoing through every living room across Britain. At Windsor Castle, Prince William sat watching with Catherine by his side. He closed his eyes slowly and took a long breath. Even through the television screen, you could feel the moment. That instant when love and responsibility crash into each other. In just one sentence, Charles had confirmed what many people suspected, but nobody wanted to believe. He was beginning to step away from public life, quietly handing moral leadership to his oldest son. Outside the palace gates, crowds started forming. Some people cried openly, some prayed silently, others just stood there, trying to understand what this meant for their king and for their country's future. Because what came next, what happened in the hours and days following this emotional broadcast, revealed the deepest struggles inside the royal family. Struggles between leaving a legacy, staying loyal, and the love that connects them all. The hours before the announcement had been filled with worry and tension. For weeks, quiet rumors had been moving through Buckingham Palace hallways. Staff members had hushed conversations. Royal advisors exchanged concerned looks. The king's daily schedule had been changing in small but meaningful ways that said more than any official statement ever could. King Charles's health had become a subject of quiet speculation since early fall. According to people working inside the palace, he'd been getting treatment for a return of his lymphatic condition, a health battle he'd kept hidden until now. At first, palace officials dismissed the reports as just routine medical checkups. But people who knew the king personally could see the truth in his tired eyes. His energy had been draining away steadily. Even his famously careful, precise handwriting had started to shake and wobble. Without anyone noticing publicly, Prince William had already begun quietly stepping into his father's shoes, taking over royal duties and attending confidential briefings. Catherine, always composed and graceful, became his invisible support. The calm presence that reminded him to breathe between stressful meetings and keep his emotions steady when the pressure felt unbearable. Inside Highgrove House, the atmosphere had shifted from royal elegance to quiet, harsh reality. The king's private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, later described the moment when Charles asked to make a national address as the most difficult conversation of his entire career. When someone asked what the king planned to say, Charles reportedly answered that he owed both his son and his people the truth, not a fantasy that things would last forever. That morning, Queen Camilla had tried to talk him out of it. She told him he didn't have to do this now, her voice sounding more desperate than loving. She warned it would only create chaos, but Charles had already made his final decision. He told her that honest chaos was better than cowardly silence. By the time the television cameras were positioned at Highgrove, the king appeared determined. He walked through his garden one final time before facing the world, pausing briefly to touch the rose bushes he and Diana had planted together many years ago. He understood that what he was about to say would transform the monarchy forever. When the broadcast started, a deep silence fell not just over Britain, but across every part of the Commonwealth. Even before the king spoke on television, the people closest to him had sensed something was changing. Not just in his physical health, but in his spirit, his will to continue. For months, King Charles had been fighting quietly against exhaustion, forcing himself through state responsibilities and public appearances, refusing to let anyone see his weakness. But the people around him noticed the changes. They saw how he gripped his cane more tightly. They noticed how he paused before signing official papers, as though even holding a pen demanded more strength than his body could provide. At Clarence House, his staff described mornings that started later and meetings that ended earlier. One senior staff member said he was still mentally sharp, but his physical energy was disappearing fast. Everyone knew he was trying to outrun time itself. It was Princess Anne, always practical and deeply loyal, who first asked the question that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say out loud. What happens if he simply cannot continue? She'd witnessed this before with their mother, Queen Elizabeth, and remembered the quiet confusion that surrounded that transition. This time, however, the emotions were impossible to ignore. Charles wasn't just a monarch. He was a father, a husband, and a man trying to let go with dignity. Behind closed doors, conversations became more urgent and serious. Prince William began attending important briefings instead of his father. Royal staff members who used to bow to Charles now turned naturally to the younger prince for decisions. Even the Prime Minister's weekly private meetings with the king subtly shifted, still officially addressed to His Majesty, but increasingly involving William's advice and judgment. Yet nobody outside the palace walls understood the truth. Official statements continued describing the king as being in good spirits and health. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla, determined to control what the public knew, reportedly urged the communications teams to protect the crown's image, not expose its weaknesses. One senior staffer later admitted privately that she feared any hint of the king's fragility would raise questions about her own position in the new arrangement. The tension between duty and denial grew sharper each day. Charles, though physically weak, could feel this tension too. On October 17th, the day before his announcement, he asked to see William privately at Highgrove House. The two men walked slowly through the rose garden together. The king leaned heavily on his cane, while his son walked silently beside him. Charles spoke quietly, telling William that he'd been carrying more weight than he should. But that's what happens when love meets responsibility, he said. They weigh exactly the same, but feel completely different. William said nothing in response, only nodded, his eyes wet with tears. He understood this conversation wasn't about politics or power. It was about saying goodbye. That evening, as palace staff prepared the cameras for the king's national address, rumors filled newsrooms across London. Reporters from Sky News, BBC, and Reuters all hinted at a possible announcement related to succession. For the first time in years, the monarchy had gone completely silent, and in Britain, silence speaks louder than words. At Windsor Castle, Catherine watched her husband pace nervously around the study. William murmured, more to himself than to her, that his father was actually going to do it, actually going to tell the entire world. He whispered that he was next in line. Catherine stood up and rested her hand gently on his arm. She told him softly to let his father do this. She said Charles wasn't giving him a throne. He was giving him his faith, his trust. When the broadcast began the next evening, households throughout Britain turned on their televisions. Some families gathered together. Others watched alone in pubs, airports, and hospital waiting rooms. People everywhere turned toward their screens, drawn by the weight of what they were about to witness. The king's image appeared, frail but proud. His words came slowly, deliberately, unmistakably final. He said that as time humbles him, he'd come to understand that strength isn't found in holding on tightly, but in knowing when to pass the torch to someone else. At that moment, the camera briefly showed Queen Camilla's reaction. Her eyes narrowed. Her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. It lasted only a second. but it was enough for viewers to feel the hidden tension behind the carefully staged unity. Outside Highgrove, crowds had already gathered holding candles and waving flags. When the king finished speaking, the air felt thick with disbelief. Many people wept openly. Others applauded quietly, as though mourning and gratitude had somehow merged into a single emotion. And perhaps you, watching this right now, can feel that same mixture of sadness and admiration. If your father or mentor had to hand over everything he built, his life's work, his legacy, his very identity, could you accept it without feeling resentment or anger? Tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from tonight, and what legacy means to you personally. Because across every border and culture, one truth remains constant. Love may guide a family, but legacy tests it. And for the royal family, that test had only just begun. In the hours following the king's statement, Highgrove became the quiet center of a storm sweeping across the entire world. Every television network carried the same headline: King Charles confirms Prince William as future head of the monarchy. For the first time in modern royal history, a reigning monarch had chosen to publicly hand over moral and operational leadership while still alive. It was an act of humility and powerful symbolism that blurred the line between duty and love. But behind the calm surface of the broadcast, emotions were running dangerously high. Inside the sitting room at Highgrove, Charles sat in complete silence, the adrenaline from delivering the speech finally leaving his body. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a cup of tea. He said softly, more to himself than anyone else, that it was done. His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, released a deep breath, the kind of breath you only release after months of quiet dread and worry. Across the room, Queen Camilla stood by the window with her back turned away. She said, her voice measured but sharp, that he didn't have to phrase it like that. She told him he'd made it sound like a farewell, like he was dying. Charles looked up at her and replied that it was a farewell, Camilla. The crown must outlive its keeper. He said she knew that better than anyone. She turned around, her expression hardening. She told him she knew what the world would make of it. They'd think he'd surrendered, or worse, that she had pushed him into this decision. Charles replied quietly that she should let them think whatever they wanted. History would be kinder than gossip ever could be. What filled the room after that wasn't anger exactly. It was distance. The same distance that had been growing between them over the past months. For all her strength and determination, Camilla had built her entire life on being close to power. Watching her husband give it up, even symbolically, felt like losing her place beside him. Meanwhile, at Windsor Castle, William and Catherine sat together in stunned silence, replaying the speech over and over in their minds. The king's words had been beautiful, but hearing them spoken aloud made the weight of inheritance feel terrifyingly real. William rubbed his temples, exhausted. He muttered that his father had turned an entire lifetime into a single sentence, and now that sentence belonged to him. Catherine leaned closer and told him that his father hadn't left him a burden. He'd left him a chance to lead without breaking under the pressure. Later that night, William received a phone call from Princess Anne. Her tone was steady and controlled, but there was something raw and emotional beneath it. She told him their father was resting now, but William should know that Charles was weaker than he let anyone see. That statement, she said, cost him more than anyone realized. William closed his eyes tightly. He whispered that he knew, that he could see it in his father's shaking hands. Anne paused, then her voice softened. She told him that their father was proud of him. Charles had told her yesterday that he'd seen his son become the man he'd prayed he himself could be. The phone line went quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, William felt both deep comfort and sharp fear. The torch had been passed, yes, but it burned brighter and felt heavier than ever before. In London, political circles were already buzzing with conversation and speculation. The Prime Minister's office released a formal statement acknowledging the situation. The government extended its respect to His Majesty the King for his wisdom and transparency. The crown remained steadfast under His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, who commanded the full confidence of the nation. It was a diplomatic way of saying what the world already understood. Britain had entered a completely new chapter. One not defined by grand coronations or elaborate ceremonies, but by gradual quiet transformation. At Clarence House, royal advisors met late into the night discussing practical details and logistics. Should there be an official Regency Council established? Would William now attend private meetings in the King's place? How would this affect relationships with Commonwealth nations? Every question was answered with carefully chosen phrases, but the underlying truth was clear. Nobody had ever done this before. There was no playbook, no historical precedent to follow exactly, and then there was Camilla. In the days that followed, her silence became louder than any words could be. She was photographed leaving Highgrove with a strained, tense expression on her face, her car heading toward Raymill House, her private, personal retreat. The tabloid newspapers pounced on the image immediately with dramatic headlines like "Queen Camilla's Fury After King's Statement" and "Is Britain Seeing Two Thrones?" A palace aide tried to quiet the rumors by issuing a brief clarification, stating that Her Majesty remained devoted to the King and continued supporting His Majesty's decisions. But the public had already chosen its own narrative, one of quiet heroism for Charles and moral clarity for William, while Camilla's image slipped once more into the shadows of public doubt. For William, the aftermath felt completely overwhelming. He was now expected to step into every state briefing, handle all royal patronages, and represent his father's vision while carrying the unspoken anxiety of eventually losing him. At night, when the cameras were gone and the palace was quiet, Catherine would find him standing alone, staring out at the gardens. He told her once that he kept thinking he wasn't meant to inherit this way. Not yet, not like this, not while his father was still alive. She placed her hand gently over his and told him that nobody ever is ready, but he was prepared because his father believed he was. Meanwhile, at Highgrove, Charles sat alone at his old writing desk. The house was completely silent, except for the steady ticking of an antique clock that once belonged to his mother. He picked up his fountain pen, his hand shaking noticeably, and began writing a letter addressed to his son. He wrote that when the weight feels unbearable, William should remember he's not carrying a crown. He's carrying people. That's the difference between having power and having purpose. He signed it simply with one word, Papa. When he finished writing, he placed the letter carefully inside an envelope marked "To be opened when I am gone." Then he leaned back in his chair, looking toward the window where the evening star had just begun to shine in the darkening sky. He smiled faintly, whispering words that nobody else would hear. He said the future was safe, and for the first time in many months, he allowed himself to truly rest. The following morning, Britain woke up to headlines that struck like thunder across the nation. Every major newspaper carried the same powerful image. King Charles seated before the nation, physically frail but mentally resolute, announcing that his son would lead where he no longer could. But it wasn't the speech itself that shocked the country most deeply. It was what came immediately after. Just hours later, Queen Camilla's private comments were leaked to the press. A senior palace staffer, speaking under condition of complete anonymity, claimed that she had told close friends the king was not thinking clearly anymore. She allegedly said he was being guided into this decision by other people. Within minutes, tabloid newspapers turned the quote into front-page scandal. Headlines screamed, "Camilla questions the king's sanity," "Palace rift deepens," and "War of the Windsors." At Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere became electric with tension. Staff members rushed between rooms, whispering urgently, erasing statements, rephrasing official responses. The communications team debated for hours about whether to deny the leak or simply ignore it, but the damage was already done. In the public's eyes, Camilla had transformed from grieving supportive wife to potential power-hungry usurper. At Highgrove, Charles sat quietly by the window with the newspaper spread out before him. He didn't speak for several long minutes. Finally, he sighed deeply and said softly that she was frightened, not cruel. Power makes even good people become defensive. Princess Anne, always direct and honest, replied from across the room that defensiveness wasn't the same thing as loyalty. She told her brother he'd done what he had to do, and now the rest of them would hold the line and protect what he'd built. That same day, Prince William faced his very first test as the unofficial head of the family. Reporters shouted questions loudly as he arrived for a meeting at Clarence House. They yelled, asking if the Queen disagreed with the King's statement, if he was preparing to take the throne, and whether he would respond to the leaked comments. William stopped briefly at the entrance steps, his face composed but noticeably pale. He said that his father's health and his wishes remained their family's absolute priority. He stated they were united as a family, even when the world doubted it. Then, without answering another question, he entered the building. Inside, he found Catherine waiting with a folder full of press updates and public reaction summaries. She'd been following every response across social media, the wave of sympathy for the king, the widespread praise for William's calmness, and the sharp public criticism of Camilla. She told him quietly that people now saw him as their anchor, their steady point. Every single word he said mattered more than ever. He ran his hand through his hair, exhaustion clearly lining his face. He murmured that he didn't ask to be their anchor, but if he didn't hold perfectly still, they would all sink together. Meanwhile, at Raymill House, Camilla's isolation deepened dramatically. Reporters camped outside the gates day and night, shouting her name, flashing cameras through the hedges, trying to catch a glimpse. Inside, she walked from room to room holding her phone, ignoring dozens of messages piling up. For the first time in her entire royal life, she had absolutely no control over the story being told about her. When her private secretary carefully suggested releasing a clarification statement, she replied coldly that anything she said now would just sound like a pathetic excuse. That night, the BBC aired a special program titled The Transition Within the Crown. The documentary showed decades of archive footage. Young Charles standing beside his mother Elizabeth, teenage William at his mother Diana's funeral, and finally their faces side by side during the recent emotional address. The montage ended with a simple caption that read, "The father who built the bridge, and the son who must cross it." Across the country, viewers wept openly watching it. Phone calls poured into radio talk shows with messages of love and gratitude. One listener from Manchester said the king was doing what no monarch had dared before, letting go while he still could. She said that took real courage. At exactly the same hour, Charles and William spoke privately over the phone. The king's voice sounded faint, but surprisingly steady. Charles said, almost smiling, that he'd heard they'd crowned William the sensible one now. William replied that his father had given them good reason to. Then Charles told him to give the people something even greater than sense. Give them faith. That's all he'd ever wanted to leave behind as his legacy. Neither man mentioned Camilla during the call, though both understood the wound would take considerable time to heal properly. For now, the monarchy had weathered its first major public storm under the new informal arrangement. Before dawn broke the next morning, William stood alone in his private study. The first light of morning was just beginning to brush across his tired face. On the desk lay two significant objects: his father's written statement and a framed photograph of them together from years ago, laughing under the rain at Balmoral Castle. He touched the glass gently and whispered that he would carry it all, that his father should just rest now. Outside the window, rain began falling again, soft and unrelenting, almost cleansing. And as London slowly woke to a quieter day, the image of two generations bound together by love, pain, and shared destiny lingered in every heart across the nation. The torch had been passed, not through elaborate ceremony or legal proclamation, but through profound personal sacrifice. In the days that followed both the king's statement and Camilla's alleged private remarks, the royal household entered a strange new calm, the kind that only comes after a storm powerful enough to rearrange everything in its path. Buckingham Palace released no additional comments, no clarifications, no official denials. Instead, the royal press office quietly shifted public attention toward Prince William and Princess Catherine, who began taking on an even larger, more visible public role. The next scheduled royal engagement, originally planned for King Charles to attend, was suddenly led by William instead, a visit to a children's hospice in Bristol. The sight of him kneeling beside seriously ill children, holding their small hands with a faint but genuinely compassionate smile, became the defining image of that moment. Newspapers called it the true beginning of the new era. But within palace walls, the emotional weight of this transition was still felt deeply by everyone involved. At Highgrove House, Charles spent most of his days resting peacefully in the garden. His doctors firmly insisted on near-complete withdrawal from any work duties, and the monarch who had once filled every single hour with correspondence and official briefings now found himself quietly watching the seasons gradually change. Yet there was no bitterness in him whatsoever, only deep reflection. He told his physician once that it felt strange to spend decades fighting desperately for relevance and purpose, only to finally find peace in complete surrender. Camilla, meanwhile, remained isolated at Raymill House, unseen publicly for many days. Her staff claimed she was recovering from severe stress, though palace insiders said she had flatly refused to return to public life until the negative narrative cooled down significantly. In private moments, she felt deeply betrayed, not just by the palace system, but by Charles himself. She was overheard telling a close friend that he'd handed the entire nation to William, and in doing so, had completely erased her from the picture. Her withdrawal left a very visible void beside the king, one that Princess Anne instinctively stepped in to fill. Anne visited Highgrove regularly, often joining her brother for afternoon tea. Together, they discussed everything except the monarchy itself. Anne said one afternoon that they'd both done their part faithfully, and the rest now belonged to the next generation. Charles smiled faintly and murmured yes, but added it was deeply comforting to know everything was in such good, capable hands. At Windsor Castle, William and Catherine felt that same complicated mixture of overwhelming responsibility and quiet awe. Catherine often found her husband awake before dawn, sitting at his desk completely surrounded by briefing folders and handwritten notes from advisors. William would say, looking toward a letter from his father pinned carefully on the wall, that Charles was still guiding him. Every decision felt like an echo of his father's voice and wisdom. Public sentiment rallied strongly around this new arrangement. Opinion polls showed unprecedented approval ratings for William and Catherine, especially among older British citizens who saw in them a reflection of duty beautifully softened by genuine empathy. News anchors and commentators called them the bridge between royal tradition and a modern tomorrow. Yet beneath all the public grace and approval, William carried an invisible ache deep inside. Each day that he filled his father's shoes, he feared it brought them one step closer to a final, permanent goodbye. Catherine would remind him gently that his father was still here, still present, just quieter now than before. On October 20th, 3 full days after the emotional address, the palace released a small, simple update. It stated that His Majesty continued to rest comfortably at Highgrove House. The Prince and Princess of Wales would represent the crown at all upcoming state functions. There was no mention whatsoever of Camilla. No discussion of formal abdication, just the slow, steady rhythm of a monarchy, carefully adapting to a completely new heartbeat. That same evening, William made a private, personal visit to see his father. The garden at Highgrove glowed beautifully with candlelight, and Charles was sitting peacefully beneath an old oak tree, the exact same spot where he'd filmed his very first address as king. When William approached slowly, Charles looked up and smiled weakly but warmly. The king said it was much quieter without all the noise now. William replied softly that it suited him well. Charles gently corrected him, saying it suited the crown itself, and that William would eventually learn that quiet doesn't mean weak. Sometimes, he explained, it's actually the loudest form of strength anyone can show. They sat together for nearly an hour, saying very little, simply watching the night slowly settle over the beautiful English countryside. No ceremony happened. No speeches were made. Just 2 men bound together by blood and shared legacy, passing the crown not through legal documents or ancient ritual, but through pure, unconditional trust. And as the lanterns flickered gently in the garden that evening, it became perfectly clear that history was already rewriting itself, not as a tragic ending, but as a heartfelt inheritance passed from father to son. By the time the leaves at Highgrove began turning rich shades of bronze and gold, Britain had already quietly adjusted to its transformation. There were no royal fanfares played, no grand military parades organized, only the soft, deeply reverent tone that naturally comes when an entire nation realizes history has fundamentally changed without a single trumpet being blown. King Charles spent his mornings walking very slowly through the gardens, his cane tapping softly against the gravel path with each careful step. He spoke rarely now, but people close to him said he seemed somehow lighter, as though in letting go, he had finally found genuine peace. He told a visiting friend from the Church of England that it was a strange kind of freedom. The freedom of knowing your life's purpose was truly complete. Meanwhile, Prince William and Princess Catherine began fully embodying the new face of modern monarchy, one built far less on grandeur and spectacle, and much more on authentic grace and human connection. Their public appearances felt less like rigid royal protocol and more like genuinely meaningful connection with ordinary people. At one public event, William was asked directly how his father was coping with everything. He smiled faintly and answered that his father was finally taking real time to just be himself, to simply exist, and he thought the entire nation was learning to do exactly the same thing. Behind that simple statement lay the profound truth of this entire transition, not the dramatic spectacle of succession, but the quiet beauty of genuine humility. Across the Commonwealth nations, people everywhere spoke about the king's decision not as an act of weakness or failure, but as a rare moment of absolute clarity. In an age completely defined by endless ambition and constant striving for more, Charles had offered an incredibly rare lesson, that knowing precisely when to step back can actually be the most powerful form of leadership anyone can demonstrate. At a memorial service held for the late Queen Elizabeth later that same week, Archbishop Justin Welby reflected thoughtfully on that exact truth. He said that greatness is never measured by how tightly we desperately hold on to power, but rather by how willingly we pass it on with love and grace. It was as though he had spoken the perfect epilogue to Charles's entire reign as monarch. Queen Camilla, still largely withdrawn from any public life, eventually released a short, carefully written statement, her first since all the controversy began. She wrote that change is never easy for anyone, but her husband's decision reflected genuine courage, not frailty or weakness. She would stand beside him in prayer, exactly as she always had. It was a rare public act of humility from her, and for the first time in several weeks, the British public softened their harsh judgment toward her. For William and Catherine, daily life gradually settled into a new, more sustainable rhythm. Mornings were spent fulfilling royal duties and obligations. Evenings were spent reading bedtime stories to their children. The delicate balance between duty and normality was finally beginning to make real sense to them both. Yet even in this newfound steadiness and routine, the emotional residue of the transition still lingered heavily. One quiet evening, as they prepared for bed together, Catherine whispered thoughtfully that William's father hadn't just passed him the crown itself. He'd passed him something far more valuable, peace of mind and spirit. William smiled quietly in the darkness and said that he hoped he could keep it shining brightly for the next generation. That night, under the soft, steady English rain, Highgrove House glowed faintly in the distance. Two different eras, father and son, coexisting together in perfect harmony. And beyond the tall royal fences, people across the entire world found themselves talking not just about kings or royal titles, but about something far more deeply personal and universal, the courage required to truly let go, and the grace needed to move forward into an uncertain future. Maybe that's the most important lesson this entire story leaves behind for all of us, that every single life, no matter how extraordinarily powerful or completely ordinary, eventually reaches a critical moment where holding on too tightly becomes the very thing that breaks us apart. True wisdom lies in understanding exactly when to release our grip, not in defeated surrender, but in faithful trust of what comes next. In Charles's final act as an actively serving monarch, he gave the entire world a profound lesson in dignity and grace. In William's quiet, humble acceptance of this enormous responsibility, he gave it renewed hope for the future. Together, they reminded millions of people worldwide that the true strength of any legacy is never measured in glittering crowns or grand palaces, but in simple human compassion and love. And as Britain carefully steps into its uncertain new chapter, one fundamental truth remains absolutely clear and unchanging. The crown may glitter beautifully under bright lights, but it endures through generations only because of love. A love that truly listens, forgives completely, and continues forward no matter what. If this story genuinely moved you emotionally, please take just a moment to share in the comments where you're watching from right now. Whether it's London, New York, Sydney, or somewhere completely different in between, I'd love to know. What does the word legacy mean to you in your own personal life? Don't forget to hit that like button on this video. Leave your honest thoughts and reactions in the comments below. And make sure you subscribe to this channel for many more stories where history meets humanity, where even the mightiest crowns are carried by real people, not simply worn as symbols. Because in the end, every reign, whether royal or not, is really just a journey of constantly learning when to lead others, when to listen carefully, and when to finally let go.